All right, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of Canada in the Second World War. Obviously, if you are just clicking this right now, I'd recommend you go back and watch Canada part 1, and then you'll be set up for where we're going to start here in the second part. Just a reminder that this pair of lectures is kind of Canada-centric. It's sort of focused on, the areas of the war that Canada was involved with. Of course, we're going to refer to the Battle of Stalingrad or Pearl Harbor and things like that, and we did a last lecture as well. But really, when it comes to really focusing on the Canadian contribution, those areas, of course, will be given a special focus in this lecture. Where we kind of finished off last time is the idea that things are now beginning to slightly turn. It's fair to say that the two most significant turning points of the war, first in the European theater, would be the Battle of Stalingrad. That was the first battle that the Germans actually lost, and from that battle forward, Germany was in a very gradual retreat. In the Pacific theater, many would argue that the turning point would be the Battle of Midway in the summer of 1942, when Japan would lose a significant number of aircraft carriers, and that, of course, would be kind of the death knell. So from that point forward, Japan was also in retreat. Now, back in Europe, there is a little bit of hope. I think when word got out that the Soviets were victorious in Stalingrad, what a tremendous lift that was to people, particularly in Western Europe, but of course most importantly in France, because that was the one nation that had not been invaded effectively and certainly had not been occupied by the Nazis. So any turn in the tide is going to be celebrated greatly. Keep in mind, by 1942, the Americans are now involved in this war, but they are at that point really heavily bogged down in the Pacific, although they are very active in North Africa as well. But their European presence really won't take full effect until after the D-Day landings of 1944. All right, let's begin. So Churchill, as you know, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, felt the best way to capture Europe was through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy and Sicily. Now let me just draw your attention to this map over here. I know it's a little fuzzy, but I'm sure you could probably make out, here's Great Britain, here's Ireland, France, Spain, Germany, Poland. This is, of course, a more recent map, so the borders are going to be different. As you know, the Nazis had basically occupied a significant part of Soviet territory. They occupied, of course, Poland, France, Austria. So this part was locked pretty tight in Nazi control. What Churchill was suggesting, that if we come around this way through the Straits of Gibraltar and attack from Sicily and Italy, and we come up this way, that was considered the soft underbelly. That is to suggest that German reinforcements were not as strong here as they were up here in France, Germany, and Poland. So if we get them from underneath and work our way up, that is going to be the strategy that Churchill would take, which is kind of interesting, because if you look at his role in the First World War, that is Winston Churchill's, his thinking was that the Battle of Gallipoli, which is similar, because that was also coming at Europe from sort of underneath as well. So anyway, July 10th, 1943, Canadians participated in the Allied invasion of Sicily, which is the island right here. So they came over, I believe, from Tunisia, Sicily. Once they took Sicily, then they could move into Europe. It took the island in 2 weeks. In September, they moved on to Italy, where the rugged terrain, muddy conditions, cold, rainy conditions harked back to the horrors of World War I. It was unusually cold, considering, it's Italy, which is, of course, more southern and in the Mediterranean, but at this particular September, it was pretty nasty weather. Advances were slow. Battles often fought house by house and street by street. The most, and I'm sure I'll mention it a little later, the most significant battle that the Canadians fought in Italy was called the Battle of Ortona. in the town of Ortona. And Ortona was sort of seen as sort of a mini Stalingrad. That is to suggest that the fighting was done in the streets, it was done in homes and buildings, and fought room to room to room. So it was a brutal battle. There it is there. In the town of Ortona, Canadians fought for a month, losing 1,300 soldiers before the Germans withdrew. So in a way, it was kind of a victory for the Canadians. The advance through Italy was difficult, but on June 4th, 1944, they finally took Rome, but fighting continued in Italy until the spring of 1945. So Rome being, of course, down in the southern part of Italy, then you've got all of this as well. You'll notice the date, June 4th. Only 2 days later would occur, of course, the D-Day landing. So the fact that they were able to take Rome, fascist forces moved up Italy past what was called the Gustav Line, and but the fight wasn't over. The Italian fascists and the German reinforcements there to defend Nazi interests held on pretty tight right till the end of the war. So, all right. Well, so much to talk about with D-Day. So, June 6th, of course, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, a full-scale invasion of Europe. And there were 5 landing points over an 80-kilometer stretch of beach in Normandy. Utah and Omaha were the American beaches. Gold was the British beach. Juno was Canadian. And Sword was British. Okay, so Juno was entirely a Canadian effort. The landings were preceded by massive air attacks and paratroopers who landed the night before behind German lines. Oh, it's so hard for me to just kind of whip through this, and because there's so much to talk about and so many important parts of this battle. And I've always said, and I've said many times before in my other lectures dealing with the Second World War, that we have to remember that while the invasion was on the morning of the 6th of June, the evening before, paratroopers were sent over into occupied Normandy, and they were dropped behind enemy lines in the middle of the night to destabilize communications, to destroy bridges, railway networks, to basically destroy the ability of Germany to respond to the invasion. And you have to consider that when these bombers are flying over Normandy, they're getting shot at, and some of them are getting shot out of the sky. So that in itself is terrifying. But those that make it out of the airplane jump out with their parachutes, and because it's so densely, part of it is so densely forested, and there's lots of open fields, of course, as well, and hedgerows as they're called. These guys are heading out in the middle of the night. Some of them are landing in trees, so they're hanging from their parachute, maybe too high to unclip themselves because they'll break their legs. Maybe there are German formations underneath them, and God forbid you get recognized or get seen, because they'll simply shoot you. Others who maybe land in a field have to quickly gather up their parachute and hide it, but then you have to now connect with all the other comrades who have jumped out of the same plane, who are part of your platoon or battalion. So it's a pretty terrifying experience. And what they would do is they would make like bird call sounds in order to connect with each other. So once they would then connect with each other, then they would begin the process of trying to destabilize German communication. So the paratroopers the night before really deserve more credit. 30,000 Canadians landed on Juno Beach facing concrete German bunkers, barbed wire, and machine gun fire, which they overcame as they headed inland. Allies had 2 main advantages. We had massive air and naval support, and a plan the Germans never picked up on. The one remarkable story, I mean many in relation to D-Day, literally hundreds of thousands of men waited on the coastal ports of Great Britain for word that they were going. They didn't know the day. They were not told the day until the day before. And what's remarkable is the Germans never actually picked up on the fact that there was going to be an invasion on that day. The Germans were so focused on, I don't have a map here, but it's so focused on the shortest distance between France and Britain, which be the port of Calais and Dover Beach. And if you look on a map, it's like this distance, and then the south coast of Britain and Normandy is like this distance. So what the Allies do is they have all these rubber tanks made. They had troops moving around. They set up tents. So when the Germans would do reconnaissance, they would see all this activity in Dover, near Dover. So they think, okay, when the invasion comes, that's where it's going to come. But that was not the case. So there's a lot of really interesting decoys that went on as well. 359 Canadians died and 715 were wounded on day one. For the next 11 months, the Allies advanced through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. So, getting on the beach and taking the beach was just the beginning of this incredibly crucial fight. The Allies simply could not afford to lose. They had to keep pushing, and of course Hitler is sending everybody and everything out to confront this invasion. So, the beaches were incredibly well fortified, but Juneau was less well fortified than, say, Omaha. Omaha was one of the most heavily fortified beaches, and it is made infamous by the incredible scene from the film Saving Private Ryan, where the opening sequence is the American invasion of Omaha Beach. So the campaign was exhausting, brutal, and dangerous, but as they were welcomed as liberators throughout these countries, it made the effort worthwhile. Here's the thing. The French had been under Nazi occupation for almost 5 years. They were dying for freedom and liberty, and they wanted, nobody likes to be occupied, especially the brutality of the Nazis made it even more unpleasant. So when the Canadians and the Americans and the British slowly worked their way through, and this was a grueling process, you can imagine that the French civilians were pretty excited to have them there. Alright, so March 1945, as the Allies attacked Germany, Canada was given the task of liberating the Netherlands. Now if you look on a map, the Netherlands is sort of up northeast, if you will, from France. And while the Americans and the British continued to sweep through Germany, Canada was given the job of working through the Netherlands. An earlier attempt to liberate the Netherlands had failed. It was called Operation Market Garden. And as the result of the Germans destroyed the ports of Rotterdam and Amsterdam and flooded much of the countryside. So this was a war of destruction for the Nazis. I mean, if they couldn't have it, they were going to destroy it. They were going to leave you nothing in the process. So, it was pretty relentless sets of circumstances when you're fighting an enemy like the Nazis. And Canada advance was slow as they fought house to house, but by May 4th the German troops were surrounded and they surrendered. So this is very interesting that the German troops surrendered to the Canadians on May 4th, and only 4 days later the war would come to an end. So, it was very, very near the end of the war at that point. Canadians had begun food drops over the Netherlands even before they beat the Germans, but soon trucks brought food and fuel to the Dutch as well. And to this day, anytime you go to Holland, Canadians are lauded for their efforts in the Second World War. And I have a very interesting experience I'll briefly tell you. When I was in Amsterdam in 1988, I was in college at the time, and I went one summer to holiday with a girlfriend at the time. And it's interesting, at that point in my life I didn't know so much about, I was really interested in European history, and I hadn't taken a lot of Canadian at that point, and I didn't really know the full extent of Canada's contribution to liberating the Netherlands. And I was in a cafe with my girlfriend. We were having coffee and a donut or something, and the waitress noticed a Canadian flag on my coat. I had a jean jacket actually, and she saw the Canadian flag and she said, "Oh, are you Canadian?" And I said, "Yes, we are." And they said, "Well, thank you so much, and we so much appreciate everything that your country did for us." And she gave us the coffee and the muffin for free. And I didn't understand why, but I just smiled and said thank you. I thought maybe it was just because we were Canadian. Boy, they must really like Canadians in Holland. Of course, I learned later in a conversation, I was talking to a fellow at the hotel we were staying at, telling him what happened. He said, well, of course, you guys liberated the Netherlands. And I thought, oh my God, you know, I didn't realize that at the time. So it was very interesting. Canadians were hailed as the heroes by the Dutch, and they still are to this day. So every Liberation Day, May 4th, Canadian flags come out. It's quite remarkable. While Allies continued to advance through Germany in the west, the USSR was making great strides in the east. And of course that war, which we talked about last lecture as well, was a war of racial annihilation. It was a brutal, brutal war, fought in horrible conditions, horrible climate, and you know, this was a fight for survival from the Soviets. I mean, literally for a life and death struggle against the racism of Nazism. So Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, but Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin rather than submit to the Allies. And I know there's a lot of theories out there. Some of you may have watched television programs or documentaries that Hitler somehow flew out of Berlin and ended up in Argentina, living high and mighty till he passed away however many years later. Although the evidence is pretty clear. And while conspiracy theories are fun, you really have to be careful of conspiracy theories. Oftentimes they just kind of create too many forks in the road, and you can end up, you know, spinning in circles trying to figure something out that didn't actually happen. So evidence is pretty clear that he did commit suicide, along with his mistress and wife, who I believe they were married just before they committed suicide, and Eva Braun. So, well, if there was one thing in the war that could make all your efforts and your sacrifice justifiable beyond just fighting a nasty enemy, it would have to be the revelations of the Holocaust. Now, those of you that don't know anything about the Holocaust or are just learning about this for the first time, this is such an important topic. You know, I can't even begin to express how incredibly tragic this period was. And you know, when the Allies began to move into Germany and when the Russians began to move into Poland as the retreating Nazi armies faded away, what we began to discover were these horrific camps that we had heard about in rumor. But nobody could really imagine that the Nazis would have the audacity to try to exterminate a group of people, in this case, the Jews of Europe. As the Allies entered Germany, they came into contact with the death camps where millions of Jews had been killed. Stacks of bodies, starving people filled the camps in Bergen-Belsen, in Buchenwald, in Treblinka, and Auschwitz in Poland, Auschwitz being the largest camp and of course where the most amount of death would occur. Anti-Semitism of the Nazis was well known in the 1930s, and by 1941 Hitler had adopted something called the Final Solution, a horrific plan of extermination of all Jews. So the Final Solution was sort of drawn up, if you will, at a conference in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee in January 1942, and that's where architects brought in their design for the, you know, the ovens and the camps and everything. I mean, this was extremely well planned out. This wasn't just haphazardly done. This was industrial slaughter. This was planned, malignant, malevolent murder. So the reason we revisit this topic time and time again is simply for the fact that it happened, and believe it or not, there are those out there who continue to deny that it happened, or that the scope of which it happened was much less than what historians suggest it was. We know that at least 6 million people, Jews, were killed in the Holocaust, and so, you know, you just have to kind of be on guard all the time for people who might suggest otherwise. But the evidence is there. You know, it's interesting, when the Americans rolled into their camps, Dwight D. Eisenhower told them that we have to record this. The first people into the camp should be the camera crews, because there will be those who will deny it later. So Eisenhower was very, very plugged into the idea that there were going to be people later who would try to deny it. So the evidence is there. The camps were filmed. I mean, it's extremely unpleasant, but for the sake of being a good historian, I would look at documentary films, and there's certainly many of them on YouTube, but just be prepared to be highly disturbed by the images you see. I have seen these images for 40 years, and it never ceases to amaze me that this happened, and that it was truly, and that is and was truly tragic. So German scientists sought efficiency in mass murder and eventually developed Zyklon B, which was the gas used in these gas chambers. As people entered the camps, they were stripped of clothes and valuables, and the old and young were sent to gas chambers. If you were not deemed as worthy of being able to work in their prison camps, then you would be put to death right away. The strong were put to work until they became weak, and they too would then be killed. By 1945, the Nazis had killed 6 million Jews, Gypsies, and Slavic peoples this way in what has come to be known as the Holocaust. So, all right, well, as the war in Europe ended, the war with Japan intensified. It's interesting that in May 1945, when the war in Europe ends, the Americans are still fighting a bitter, brutal battle against the Japanese, which would not end until August. So they still got another 4-month fight in the Pacific. And I know that when the American soldiers heard that the war was over in Europe, boy, they must have been so jealous. Why couldn't I have been in Europe now? Then I wouldn't have to be dealing with this. And instead, we're dealing with an incredibly tenacious enemy in the Japanese Imperial armies. Most of the Japanese Air Force and Navy had been destroyed, but the army was still very strong. Since the Japanese demonstrated that they would fight to the last man, the U.S. decided to use the atomic bomb, equal in power to 20,000 tons of TNT. For a number of years, U.S. and British scientists had been working on the Manhattan Project, a secret plan to develop a nuclear bomb. Canada contributed uranium, which was mined at Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories. On August 6th, a U.S. bomber named the Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother, dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, killing 70,000 people, and 130,000 people would be wounded. 3 days later, because the Japanese did not surrender, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 40,000, and the Japanese finally decided to surrender, which would officially end the Second World War. Now, if you look at my 3-part series on the Second World War, which is looking at it from a global perspective, I go into great detail about the pros and cons and the difficult decision of actually dropping these bombs. But the reality was that the Japanese proved that they were not willing to surrender. And if you could drop a bomb that tragically killed 200,000 people instantaneously, or what was it, 110,000 instantaneously, it would be far fewer than those who would die if Americans required a 1 million man invasion of the home island of Japan. You would see a tremendous amount of death in civilians as well. So it's such a horrible thing to try to rationalize, but the reality was that dropping the bombs would lead to far fewer Japanese casualties than had the Americans invaded. So it was a difficult thing. The other advantage of the bomb was that it was sending a signal to the Soviet Union, who was always kind of a tricky ally. I mean, the Soviets and the Americans were only allies because of their mutual disdain and desire to eliminate the Nazi threat. Once that threat was over, the incompatibility of American and Soviet systems became very clear, and both of them were now beginning to figure out each other's behavior and intentions. So dropping the bomb was multi-purpose. It also prevented the necessity of the Soviets invading Japan as well. And that was important because the Americans and the Soviets and the British and French are trying to figure out how to sort Germany out, and having to do it between the four of them was very complicated, particularly with the Soviets as well. So, All right, well, you can imagine the impact that this war was having on the domestic home front as well. Canadian women became paramount to war production of goods by becoming welders, drillers, and machine operators. Many single women moved to dormitories near factories where, in addition to employment, the government subsidized food and rent. Mackenzie King, remember he was the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, his concerns about inflation, which means kind of too many dollars chasing too few goods, led his government to sell victory bonds, which brought the government increased revenue and helped finance the war. Very similar pattern to what we saw in the First World War as well. In 1942, King implemented rationing, which limited goods Canadians could purchase each week, but nothing near the requirements in England and the US. So, of course, England's rationings were extreme because the war on the Atlantic, the Germans had really effectively eliminated a huge amount of supplies coming into Great Britain. So the shortages were there in Great Britain were life or death. So Labour sought a stronger voice during the war when they compromised with wage and price controls. Labour meaning workers, people working in the factories. 1944, the government allowed workers the right to join unions. And as the left-wing CCF, which later becomes the New Democratic Party, became more popular, King reacted by implementing various reformist policies like expanding social assistance and family allowance. So out of the Second World War, and really born out of the hardships and deprivations of the Great Depression, because there was no reprieve. The war starts in '39, you know, and the Depression is still on when the war actually starts. There's already a talk about building what is called a social safety net, and that is really what we saw happening in the United States under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Really became an inspiration. All right, well, early in 1940, as Germany dominated much of Europe, King implemented the National Resources Mobilization Act, giving the government the right to mobilize resources to defeat the enemy, including limited conscription for home defense. Okay, once again, we saw this happening in the First World War. I think it was called the Military Services Act. Or no, that was for enlistment. But the necessity of the government to take complete control of the economy so that we ensure that this war is fought. Everybody has to compromise. Business has to compromise. Labor has to compromise. Everybody does. You know, the understanding being that when this war is over, then we can move to a level of normalcy. In August '42, an amendment to the NRMA, the National Resources Mobilization Act, allowed for overseas conscription, with all provinces voting yes, except Quebec. Troops were then not sent until 1944, but during D-Day and the invasion that followed, Canada lost 23,000 troops, and conscription remained a thorny issue with Quebec. For those of you that don't know, I guess it's probably important I define that. Conscription. Conscription means mandatory military service. So if you get a letter in the mail saying you need to report to the federal government at 5 o'clock on Monday, you have to. It is mandatory that you go. Conscription, mandatory military service. In the final months of the war, some 12,000 NRMA conscripts were sent, but reaction was bitter in BC and Quebec. In the end, only 2,463 Canadian conscripts reached the front. Interesting. Well, under total war, Canada supplied $3.4 billion in aid to the Allies with aluminum, paper products, and petroleum, which had been discovered in Alberta. As a result, Canada's gross domestic product, the value of all goods such as food, cars, planes, and services like nursing, insurance, and education produced in a country in 1 year increased dramatically. The amount of stuff Canada was producing, the amount of people working in these industries had grown incredibly high. And what a sharp contrast to the hardships of the Great Depression. So in many ways, the war was very good for the Canadian economy. Agriculture had now been overtaken by industry, and huge investments were made in mining, production, transportation, and service industries. Canadian cities became huge contributors to the economy and attracted a wave of post-war immigration, leading to the multicultural society we know today. There was a bit of a boom, of course, not just the war brides, who were British women who married Canadian servicemen, but people were coming from all over the world to Canada, maybe to escape hardship, to escape the memory of a horrible war or economic hardship, and so on and so forth. So we really become a multicultural society that we know today, is really born out of the post-World War II period. The years between 1939 and 1949 resulted in the most dramatic changes in Canada's history. And from that point forward, from the post-war period, Canada's economy continued to grow. That's why the period of the 1950s, which we're going to look at next time, saw so much development and so much growth. And the economy in both Canada and the United States was very much in a good place. By war's end, Canada had the third largest navy and the fourth largest air force in the world. Think about that for a nation our size, making World War II a defining event in the development of our country. Of course, we don't hold on to that place, but it's remarkable to think that at the end of this war, that's where we stood. Quite remarkable. All right, so that being said, that's where we will stop for now. And once again, thank you for having a look, and we'll see you next time. Great.